Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Craftworld Eldar units that I think got a really bad rap in 9th edition and, quite honestly, didn't deserve it. We're also going to be talking a little bit about those that did, and obviously some of you guys might already have your ideas about the units that were, quite honestly bad this edition, and there were quite a few of them. And as many of you are aware, the Eldar Codex's main problem is its internal balance. So there were units when the 9th edition Codex came out that were just quite simply unable to compete with the stronger choices of the book. But there were also choices that just didn't appear in competitive lists. And honestly, these units got a reputation for being bad units, but I actually believe that a lot of them were secretly good and they were pretty effective. So we're going to talk about that today and jump right into which units had a bad rep in 9th edition that really didn't deserve it. So a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be doing a recap of Eldar units that got a bad rap in 9th edition and really didn't deserve it, of course. And we're also going to be talking about the units that did deserve the rap they got. So starting off with the units that I think got a bad rap in 9th edition and didn't deserve it were Fire Dragons, Fire Prisms, Wraithlords, Wraithguard, the Wraithcannon variant, and Autarchs. So Fire Dragons are a unit that I've featured on this channel many times. I've actually thought that Fire Dragons are quite effective for what they are. Now, if you compare them to the anti-tank options that the rest of the armies in 40k have, are they on the very pinnacle, very top of cost-effective anti-tank units? And I would argue that, yes, I think they actually are mathematically that good. So here's the thing about Fire Dragons. A lot of people compare them to different units, like, for example, Eradicators and things like this. Yes, Eradicators have much more damage, but they're also much more expensive. Now, I'm not saying Fire Dragons are the best cost-effective anti-tank unit in the game, but they are very effective for their cost. They have Strength 9 weapons, which trade more effectively with Toughness 8 and Toughness 9 vehicles than Bright Lances do. They have the ability to reroll 1s to wound against vehicles and monsters. With Exarch powers, they can get extra range, or they can get auto wounds when within 9 inches of their target. And also, they have great Alpha Strike potential with a Falcon or Webway Strike. Also, something people don't mention is that these guys actually are very good at hiding, and because they have an increased toughness and a decent armor save, they're quite durable against things that have low AP and semi-low strength. So anything strength 4 or less that wants to target them behind some cover, they will be much more durable against those types of attacks. For example, things like the Airburst Fragmentation Launcher from Tau. If a Tau player wants to wipe out your Fire Dragons with this, they're going to need a lot of Airburst Fragmentation Launchers because they're wounding on 4s, and they're not hitting on a very good ballistic skill. And on top of that, Fire Dragons also have a decent armor save at a 3+. And of course, this is increased even more when targets are fired out of line of sight. So because these guys have battle focus, they can easily get within range of a target, especially with the Exarch power that gives them the extra range, and they can get behind terrain fairly easily. So I actually think these guys are an underrated unit, and I think they have been since the Codex first came out. And no, they're not as cost-effective as D-Cannons, for example. I think D-Cannons are obviously the all-stars of the Codex, and the reason why people don't take much else for their anti-tank is because, quite frankly, D-Cannons kind of solve everything. They ignore line of sight, they have really high strength, they do mortal wounds, they have blast, etc. But Fire Dragons are still very effective at killing heavy tanks. And the thing I like about Fire Dragons that D-Cannons cannot really do is they can be put in a Falcon, or they can Webway Strike into the battle and potentially get a turn 2, or even a turn 1 if given a Falcon, Alpha Strike on an enemy hard target. So I know that your opponent can screen you and stuff like that, but even having the utility of that at your disposal and something your opponent has to worry about, that can change the course of a game. Like, for example, if your opponent has to worry about the Fire Dragons coming in and blowing up their Land Raider, then he's going to have to do a better job hiding that Land Raider, which might make that Land Raider a bit slower to get into the battle in the first place. And whatever's inside of that Land Raider is also going to be equally slowed down because of it. And this is true of a numerous amount of situations that you could find yourself in games. So are Fire Dragons a unit that you're going to see tons of in battles? Absolutely not. I don't think, more than one unit is absolutely necessary. But I do think in certain lists that lack a little bit of turn 1 or turn 2 presence, or maybe even just need a little bit of extra anti-tank punch, I think Fire Dragons are a really effective unit to consider in your lists, especially if you're running the Biel-Tan Craftworld, or if you're running a list that really focuses on scoring the Wrath of Cain secondary objective. Okay, so moving on to the Fire Prism. So Fire Prisms have been largely underrated for most of 9th edition. And I think the main reason for that is because of not their stats or anything, but because of their unit size. They're a pretty large model, they hover in the air, they're hard to hide, and especially since Fire Prisms need to be taken in twos to benefit from the linked fire stratagem. So I can definitely see the concern with the Fire Prism. However, the Fire Prism itself, especially when taken in pairs, is extremely strong and honestly one of the best answers to things with invulnerable saves. And that is because of the linked fire stratagem, which allows it to ignore invuls. On top of that, with the linked fire stratagem, only one Fire Prism actually has to draw line of sight, which means the other one is safe to stay behind obscuring terrain and not risk itself to be destroyed. And that also, unironically, makes it a great target for Fire and Fade. It can also be upgraded with the Vectored Engine's special rule to give it a once per game battle focus. And this combination is absolutely strong, and it's very good. And it's one of those things where, yes, you might not be able to do it every single turn, but just having the Fire Prisms in your backfield ready to pounce whenever the enemy brings out his toughest targets is enough to, again, make your opponent think twice about moving their big models to the middle of the board. For example, I loved bringing a pair of these in my games against things like Tyranids, because Tyranids with Zoanthropes would basically once per game get a 4+ invul save across all of their monstrous creatures. So being able to ignore that and destroy a Hive Tyrant in a single turn of shooting with a Fire Prism was absolutely fantastic and very strong. And to be honest with you guys, this was the case for a lot of armies. Chaos Demons pre-Codex were also another one that they were effective against. And of course, when the Chaos Demons got their new Codex and their invul saves changed to demonic saves, that was a little bit of a nerf to the Fire Prism. But Fire Prisms were also good against just regular Chaos Space Marines, because a lot of Chaos Space Marine players liked to take that Demon Prince. And Demon Princes were notoriously reliant on their invul saves to get them past really high damaging attacks. So having a Fire Prism being able to ignore that was honestly quite awesome. The other thing I really liked about the Fire Prism was the fact that in the late game, it had the movement speed to be able to get onto objectives and block enemies from getting onto said objectives. So just like a Wave Serpent, it could be used in a very similar way in the late game to block charge lanes, to get in enemy's way, and basically mess with your opponent. And that's really something that, despite D-Cannon's effectiveness against tanks and other targets, they are absolutely not able to do. You will never see a D-Cannon in the late game being able to block an enemy from getting on an objective, right? So Fire Prisms were able to do this, and I think they did have some versatility in that way. Not to mention their synergy with the Biel-Tan Craftworld was absolutely amazing, because of course the Biel-Tan Craftworld allows you to reroll a single hit roll per unit, which was very good with the Fire Prism as well. And then we come to the Wraithlord, which in my opinion was a extremely underrated and underappreciated unit for much of 9th edition. Now, when the Codex first came out, I remember looking at Wraithlords and thinking to myself, man, these guys really got a great buff. Their damage was looking much better, their durability was much better because they had toughness 8 now, and could basically survive better against low strength weapons, especially strength 7 weapons, which before were wounding them in 4s, now they're wounding them on 5s, which is actually a big deal considering plasma guns and autocannons and things like this would often be pretty effective answers to Wraithlords, and honestly, after the buff, autocannons, strength 7 weapons just really weren't that good, especially coupled with the -1 damage. Autocannons were basically doing nothing to them. So I thought Wraithlords were a pretty good unit, honestly, and I've used them in several lists. They have a lot of good synergy with things like Uthway. They have the core and the Craftworld keywords, which means they can benefit from a lot of buffs and auras. They're a pretty versatile weapon platform that can take all of the Eldar heavy weapons, and they can also provide combat support, being a very good defensive and denial tool. Especially for units like D-Cannons who really don't want to be charged, having a Wraithlord sticking around to block charges and screen out enemies is a very good investment. And that's just in larger point games. In smaller point games, Wraithlords are an absolute menace for their cost. And I think the reason why people don't really care for Wraithlords too much is because they're rather slow for what they are. They're a monstrous creature who only gets movement 8, which is only 1 inch more than regular infantry. Their weapons are also a little bit on the expensive side. I think that most Eldar special weapons cost less on other units. For example, a Bright Lance costs 15 points on a Warwalker, but it costs 20 points on a Wraithlord. I think that's another problem that people have with the Wraithlord. But to be honest with you guys, I do think the Wraithlord is a solid all-around choice, especially if defending certain areas of the board. So I do think Wraithlords did have a role in the Eldar Codex. I think as points did increase for the Eldar once the nerf started hitting, people started to realize that maybe we don't have the luxury of affording a Wraithlord in our army lists. But honestly, I ran quite a few lists with Wraithlords in them that were fairly effective. I think they're a very good denial tool, and again, I think they're actually pretty good in combat as well. And unlike other units in the Eldar Codex, Wraithlords have the benefit of being tough. So they can actually stick around for a few turns in combat, even against some pretty serious combat-oriented models. Let's take, for example, Thunderhammer Stormshield Terminators. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking here. Proxy Hammer, you're absolutely nuts. There's no way a Wraithlord is going to be able to survive against that. But if it's a small unit, if they're not taking them in a large unit of 10, and they're not supported by buffs, maybe it's in the later game, a Wraithlord can definitely take on a unit of Terminators. And it's not necessarily because the Wraithlord has a lot of damage. I think that its damage with the Ghostglaive is pretty good, but that's not going to be able to kill the Terminators on its own. The Wraithlord is actually able to survive against a lot of their attacks because, again, it has toughness 8, and it has a -1 damage modifier. So if a unit of 5 Terminators gets 15 attacks and they're hitting on 4s, 7 or 8 of those are going to hit. Well, only about 4 of those are going to wound. Your Wraithlord is going to get an armor save against it. So about 2 or 3 of those might actually get through. And we're assuming here that the Terminators are getting the charge, right? We're actually assuming that the Wraithlord didn't get the charge, because if the Wraithlord got the charge, there would be even less attacks to begin with. So the Wraithlord has now survived the charge. It attacks back, and in your turn, you can shoot it into combat, possibly killing even more Terminators. And of course, when it comes to your turn to strike, you'll be attacking before they can once again. And I haven't had a recent experience with this, but before Arcs of Omen dropped, I did have a situation where a Wraithlord did get into combat with a unit of Stormshield Thunderhammer Terminators. It was actually on an objective. It was charged by the Terminators, and I was actually, believe it or not, able to beat the Terminators, partially because of good rolls, I'm going to be honest, but also just because it was so damn tough. And I'm talking about that toughness 8, that 3+ armor save with the -1 damage. Those elements combined can actually turn aside many sword blows. So don't underestimate the Wraithlord. I think it's actually one of the models in this edition that has been severely underrated. Okay, so next up we have Wraithguard with Wraithcannons. So I actually think Wraithguard with Wraithcannons weren't really considered in a lot of lists outside of people who are running really lore-friendly Iandan style lists, right? And I'm guilty of this too. I didn't really find room in a lot of my lists to fit in Wraithguard with Wraithcannons, but I actually think they were pretty good. Especially in Uthway style lists where they were getting the 6-up invul save and the 5-up ignores mortal wounds. I think they have very strong weapons. They have strength 10 weapons with a decent range of 18, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but on a unit that doesn't really want to be in combat, that's awesome. And also they just do a lot of damage, right? They're very heavily anti-tank oriented and they just pound tanks into oblivion when they can get into range. They're also tough enough and resilient enough to basically ward off small arms fire, especially with buffs and cover. You throw Fortune on these guys, you throw Jinx maybe on these guys, you have them sitting in a piece of terrain, and all of a sudden they're really durable to enemy shooting. And yeah, most of the time, your opponent is not going to be able to kill them. They're just too much trouble, or more trouble I should say, than they're worth. So if your opponent does want to waste more than half of his army shooting the Wraithguard and trying to kill them in terrain, he's more than welcome to, but honestly at that point, you're winning the game in other areas of the board. Also, many people don't consider this, but Wraithguard are also a pretty good target for the Fire and Fade stratagem. And Wraithguard are a very good target for this because they can fight in no man's land and through the use of Fire and Fade, can actually get some pretty good targets and shots off while remaining safe. So, obviously I think Wraithguard do have their weaknesses. I think they're overpointed for what they are. But I actually don't think that Wraithguard with Wraithcannons are a horrible unit, right? I do, again, think they have their damage weaknesses as well. If they ever end up in combat with a unit like Grotesques or Terminators, units that deal a lot of heavy damage in close combat, I think they're probably going to be in a lot of pain. However, they're very tough, and even though they are weak to some auto-wounding effects and stuff like that, I think they're pretty durable, and honestly, if used right, one of the better units in the Codex, especially among Wraiths. And last on our list for underappreciated units, I think we have the Autarch. So the Autarch is a model that honestly had a lot of mixed reception when it first came out in the Codex. The reason why is because the Autarch was priced at a level that a lot of Eldar players were uncomfortable with paying. And that's because Farseers are just so good in an Eldar army. And compared to a Farseer, an Autarch offers the army much less durability, in the form of psychic powers like Fortune. It offers the army much less utility in the form of powers like Will of Azurian. And of course, it offers the army much less in terms of damage, in terms of things like Guide and Doom, right? So Farseers can cast all of those buffs that make an Eldar army run much better. And Autarchs just don't really have that. And in addition, when you compare an Autarch to a thing like a Space Marine captain or something like that, the stats just don't really match up for the points. Space Marine captains are honestly point for point much cheaper than Autarchs when you compare them in terms of toughness and damage. However, I think Autarchs have kind of been done dirty. Throughout 9th edition, they have gone through some changes. The command point change in Nephilim was a big upset for Autarchs, I think, because they were able to take so many relics pregame and warlord traits. But despite that, I think Autarchs do have a place in some lists. Especially lists that still want to utilize some of those relics. The Craftworld Eldar have some pretty good ones. Fire Saber is really good, and also the Phoenix Gem is a fantastic upgrade on an Autarch, especially if you give it something like the Autarch Jump Generator, which, by the way, is fantastic on the Autarch because it allows them to ignore models when making charges as well. So it kind of allows the Autarch in a lesser way to act like a Harlequin character because when you make a charge, you can ignore enemy models and you can move right over them, which is really good, especially when you combine the Autarch Jump Generator with combat weapons like the Starglaive or, of course, the Fire Saber, as I just mentioned. Things can get pretty crazy pretty quickly. In addition, the Autarch also has a great rerolls 1s to hit aura, which has been really good with the addition of Shroud Runners. So Shroud Runners are a unit that hits on 2+. You keep an Autarch near them, they're rerolling all their hits, especially if you have multiple units of Shroud Runners that are typically smaller. The Autarch is a much better investment than a Farseer with Guide would be for buffing those specific units. And like previously mentioned, the Autarch has very versatile weapon options. If you need a little bit of extra anti-tank in your list, you can give the Autarch a Dragon's Fusion Gun. If you need a little bit of extra anti-infantry, which, I mean, to be honest with you, most of the time you won't. I think that's something Eldar don't really have issues with. But you can always give it a Death Spinner, which isn't a bad option either. So I do think Autarchs are a little bit underrated. I think that for the most part, I would agree 100% that Farseers are far and above more versatile in terms of the amount of utility and damage boosting they can give your army. But sometimes Autarchs in some situations and in some builds are just better picks. And there's tricks that you can do with them that you can't do with a Farseer, like the Autarch Jump Generator, being able to move over enemy units in the charge phase. And of course, what I like the best about the Autarch is being able to take a Banshee Mask on them. So basically, if you don't want to run Banshees in your list and you still want a way to deny Overwatch for your other units that want to charge, an Autarch with a Banshee Mask is a great option for this. And all rules aside, I think Autarchs just look really cool. So those are the units I think got a bad rep in 9th edition that really didn't deserve all the hate they got. However, the units that did deserve the rap they got, I think, are Dark Reapers, Storm Guardians, Vibro Cannons, and Spiritseers. So, you know me, I'm the kind of player who likes to try out different things and doesn't necessarily think that what's just being run in high-level competitive play means that those are the only units that are good. Right? I mean, I've advocated for Fire Dragons for much of 9th edition when most competitive players have been telling basically everybody they know and their mothers that Fire Dragons are not good and that they suck, right? So I'm not that kind of player. I don't just go with what the meta is. I like to look at different units and really kind of do a deep dive into each and every one to see which ones are effective and in what situations. And even units that I thought in the past have really not been great, I've given them ample time and playtesting to be able to understand if they are actually good. And these are the units that I've playtested many times and have decided that actually do deserve the bad rap that they got. So starting off with Dark Reapers. Dark Reapers are a unit that I used to love. I used to love these guys in 4th edition. I remember these guys were my favorite unit in the entire game. You could not see me in a single game without my unit of Dark Reapers. Of course, I would always take the Exarch with the Tempest Launcher and Crackshot. And if you guys have played back then, you will know the pain that an Exarch with Crackshot could do. Basically rerolling all wounds and ignoring all cover. He was insane, and honestly, he won me a lot of games. Going forward into 5th edition, Dark Reapers quickly went out of the meta. Even though the Tempest Launcher was still good and wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, the fact that vehicles dominated that meta so much, it was just hard to find use out of them. 6th edition, they were gods again. I swear they were amazing. And honestly, they were very good in 8th edition as well. Come 9th edition, with the new codex, all of a sudden, Dark Reapers got nerfed. They got a severe nerf in the new codex. Which is weird because they also got new models, so it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. In fact, with the nerfs to Fire and Fade and how transports worked and stuff like that, not being able to Fire and Fade in and out of a transport, I didn't really understand why GW felt the need to increase their points. But they did, and Dark Reapers are probably one of the least cost-effective units in the codex. So first of all, they have penalties to moving and shooting, which they didn't used to have. They always used to hit on 3+ regardless of modifiers. They no longer ignore light cover inherently. You have to do it through something like Masterful Shots, or a similar effect, like Reveal or something like that. They're very fragile, and for the most part, they need direct line of sight. So other than the Tempest Launcher, which is honestly now mediocre at best, they need line of sight to shoot. They don't have battle focus, so they can't hop in and out of terrain like other Eldar units can. They have really mediocre AP at -2 AP, which is just not good for a heavy infantry killing unit the Dark Reapers are supposed to be. And up until recently, they were 30 points a model. 30 points a model. Man. And when GW finally recognized that Dark Reapers needed a buff, they only subtracted their points by 3 points per model, which is not nearly enough to make up for the fact that they do so little damage to enemy units. So I think Dark Reapers, when you consider that their one role is dealing damage to heavy infantry targets, and they just do such a bad job at that, they do deserve the rap they get. You know, other units have a lot of utility. You know, when I talk about Fire Prisms, you know, they can ignore invul saves. They have a purpose in an Eldar army. When you look at Dark Reapers, you're paying 135 points now for a unit that might not be able to kill 50 points worth of Marines in a single shooting phase. That kind of sucks. And for a lot of players out there who love Dark Reapers, it just feels really bad to field Dark Reapers, not because they're not meta or because they're not, you know, super competitive. Again, there's a lot of units in the Eldar Codex that are just fun to play. But these guys just don't seem to do anything cool. Again, they can't battle focus. They can't move and shoot without penalties. It's pulling teeth to get these guys to work. And honestly, unless run in a very specific build, they really just don't do well. And on top of that, even if they are running that specific build, which, by the way, is Swift Strikes and Masterful Shots, they still don't do that well, right? To be honest with you. They're outcompeted by a lot of other units in the Codex. So, yeah, Dark Reapers, unfortunately, I love them, but they're one of those units that I think really does deserve the rap they got in 9th edition. Okay, and what kind of video would this be if I didn't trash on Storm Guardians just a little bit more? So Storm Guardians are one of those units that I'm going to just be honest with you guys, I've never liked them, ever. My buddy plays Uthway, he loves his Storm Guardians, he runs a unit every single game because he has them, and I don't know why, but he says he just really likes them, and it's a fun unit for him. And obviously back in the day, they used to do a little bit more work, but nowadays they just don't seem to have a role. They have a low number of attacks, low damage, they have expensive heavy weapons. Their Serpent Scale platform, which is supposed to be this unique addition to the unit, sucks. Its stratagem is the only useful part about it. Other than that, it pretty much never does anything for them. And they have no real role in the Craftworld Eldar army and are almost outcompeted by every single combat unit in the Codex. And even just your basic Corsairs with power weapons hit much, much harder than these guys and are just much better in general, right? They're still troops. Because of the Arcs of Omen detachments, it doesn't matter if they're a compulsory choice or not. It doesn't really matter. Storm Guardians are outcompeted by almost every single unit in the Codex in combat. And here's the thing. I want to be able to use them. I really do. But currently, the only good way to run them that I've found, and even then, it's like pulling teeth, is running them in large blocks when your opponent doesn't expect the threat. So in very casual games, running them in, multiple units of 10 has worked out for me in a couple of games. And I did a video on this a while back. But other than that, I have to say, they're just not that good. And they just don't really do anything that other units in the Codex couldn't do, but better. And by the way, even regular Guardians are miles better than these guys. And we all know the Guardian Defenders aren't exactly one of the best units in the Codex. And then we come to the good old Vibrator Cannons. So the Vibrator Cannons require line of sight, which is unique for a support weapon. Most of our support weapons, being fragile, are able to fire out of line of sight. But for some odd reason, a weapon that is based on sonic technology that basically just targets the ground requires line of sight. Which kind of doesn't really make sense, but hey, there it is. And in addition to this, you would think that requiring a line of sight would mean that it would be a very powerful weapon. But unfortunately, it has a very low AP value, AP -1. So the targets that it would normally be good against with Strength 7 and Damage 2, with auto wound effects auto hit effects and a bonus to their wound, right? And for those of you guys who don't know, Vibro Cannons, if you take them in a unit of 3, they auto hit their target as long as it's not a flying target, which does make sense, and they get a +1 to wound against that target. So those are all pretty good things, right? That means they're auto hitting and they're wounding on 2+. But here's the problem. They only have AP -1, and again, that's going to mean that a lot of their targets are going to have a good chance of saving those wounds. So your regular Space Marine unit that benefits from light cover is getting a 3+ armor save against their attacks. On average, if you roll 3 of these things, you're getting 10 dice. All of them are hitting. About probably 8 are going to wound, and that means 3 Marines are going to die. But you are paying a very premium price just to kill 45 points worth of models. So I think in a lot of ways, these guys have the Dark Reaper problem, where Dark Reapers just don't do enough damage. And I think Vibro Cannons are very much in the same camp. Yeah, they can hit pretty easily. Yeah, they can wound pretty easily, but they just can't do the damage required to get through that armor. So again, those are the types of targets they're good against, and they can't get through their armor saves. So in my opinion, Vibro Cannons are just one of those units that probably needed an extra AP or 2, and they just didn't get it. So unfortunately, people are going to be using D-Cannons and Shadow Weavers probably for the rest of 9th edition. And lastly, we have the Spiritseer. So the Spiritseer is a model that I really think is cool, and I'm glad it's in the Eldar Codex. However, honestly, the Spiritseer is outcompeted by multiple HQ options, including the Autarch, and by the way, including, in my opinion, regular Warlocks. Yes, regular Warlocks, I think, outcompete this guy. The reason being is because you can only cast 1 power. And for that 1 power, it costs 75 points. And basically, if you get 2 Warlocks, yes, it is slightly more expensive, but you're also getting double the amount of powers that the Spiritseer can cast. Also, the aura that it has that benefits Wraiths, that basically allows Wraiths to reroll ones to wound, is extremely short-ranged, and honestly, most of the time, you're not going to want to put this guy in harm's way, because he is extremely fragile. He has less wounds than a Farseer at 4, doesn't have any way of being mobile, really, except for maybe a relic if you want to put something like Falcho's Wing on him or something like that. He can be a little bit more mobile, but otherwise doesn't really have a lot of options, can't be taken on a jet bike, and in most cases, again, like I said, will be outcompeted by both Farseers, Warlocks, and also Autarchs. And by the way, Autarchs do get an aura that allows units within 6 inches to reroll ones to hit, which is kind of like the same thing as this aura, except it affects everything and not just Wraith units. So Spiritseers, again, I wish they were better. I wish they had an ability that allowed them to synergize with Wraiths better that wasn't just the Tears of Isha, which, by the way, I think it's a good stratagem and everything, but I just don't think it's good enough to warrant the points of the Spiritseer. So really cool model. I hope they revamp this model when they do 10th edition. Really hoping for this model to become good again, because I do want to use it, but in this edition, it's just been quite underwhelming. So in conclusion, despite the meta that has evolved over the course of the 9th edition Eldar Codex in competitive play, I do think there were a lot of strong options that got overlooked and got a really bad rap despite them being actually quite strong. However, the internal balance of the Codex was and still is an issue, and many units were actually quite bad and did deserve their reputation, and I hope this is something that changes in 10th edition. So now that 9th edition is finally coming to its conclusion, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is the state of the Eldar Codex at the end of 9th edition. So I think that one of the things that I like most about the Eldar Codex is the way Eldar plays in this codex really feels like Eldar. I really think that the writers of the book did a great job making every single unit feel, in some way, very Eldar. And you can tell, even by looking at some of the worst units in the codex, that the writers were trying to achieve this. Even with things like Storm Guardians, right? Storm Guardians being one of the worst units in the codex, but still having special rules that on the outside made them seem like they were specialist units. So being able to reroll ones to hit when engaging enemy units on objectives was a little bit of flavor added in that I enjoyed, even though it wasn't a really great rule. Things like this made the Eldar Codex extremely cool, and I think, honestly, it felt really awesome to have units that were designed for a specific task in mind. And of course, these units that I'm talking about in this video that did deserve the rap they got didn't live up to that. But I think the fact that the writers at least tried says a lot about what direction, hopefully, the Eldar will take in the future. So as a result, I think I'm going to remain optimistic for now and hope that the same principles that the writers applied to this codex, the writers will try to apply to our index come 10th edition. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Leave a comment in the comment section if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns of any kind. I would be more than happy to address those with you guys in the coming weeks. And of course, if you do have any questions about 10th edition or the remainder of 9th edition, I'm also open to answering those as well. Or any off-topic questions. One last thing, I do want to tell you guys that I am going to be doing a video this week covering the possible changes that the data slate might bring to the Craftworld Eldar that's coming soon. The video will probably be done by the end of the weekend, but I'm hoping to get it done a little bit sooner for you guys, maybe on Saturday, but we'll go ahead and see. It's kind of a lot of work to do those videos on such a short time span, but I figured because it's a weekend, I may be able to actually just kind of do it right after the game, and that way I can remember it a little bit better anyway. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thank you so much to all my Patreon members and people who have supported the channel. Once again, I really appreciate all the help and support that you've given me. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and leave my Patreon and PayPal links in the description for those of you who do want to support the channel further. And have a good one, everybody. Hope you have a great week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.